Hi, and thanks for the opportunity to explore some ideas with you. This is a kind of a new project, and I'm trying to sort of find my way through it. So instead of a PowerPoint, I have these handouts that we can follow along a little bit. But the question that I am struggling with here is, how is it that so many experts and people in general tend to now kind of accept the assumption that governments around the world just cannot afford to lead the way towards ambitious social transformation? And so if you look at this, I had a couple of pictures here about teacher protests around the world. So education is one example of one of those things that almost everyone agrees is important, that's important economically, yet somehow it seems like government cannot find the way to come up with the money to really support education in a meaningful way. And one little tidbit there is the World Bank just recently issued a major report on education. And so the World Bank for 50 years or more has been pouring lots of money and attention into education around the world and the problem of especially in developing countries. And in this report, it basically said that hundreds of millions of children around the world still, after all these decades, reach adulthood without basic reading skills, without basic math skills. And then, it kind of disappointingly, for me, like reading this at the end, so what do they come up with of their ideas as this major world economic institution? To what are they going to do about this, and what do they advise governments to do about this? And it seemed like a kind of, oh well kind of answer that they come up with. It's not like the World Bank is going to lead some major new transformative, ambitious initiative. It's not like they're saying governments really need now to change their priorities in a major way. Instead, it focused a lot on how can we better assess and evaluate and measure teacher performance, and sort of what vague things can people do. It seemed very small scale and very unambitious, frankly. So what happens then, if you look at another slide, I have a platform of a photograph of a recent young woman who won an upstart political victory in the United States with a platform that was very ambitious, included free public higher education for all. And in the US, free healthcare for all, free housing for all, guaranteed jobs for all. Okay, so here's an ambitious program. And this is the photograph is of our right-wing news network, a Trump-supporting news network called Fox News in the United States, basically saying this is downright scary. Now that's the right wing, but I think in the mainstream, these views, if not scary, these ambitious proposals, like free education, free higher education for everyone, if they're not scary, they're treated as silly. So another slide here is about a presidential campaign in 2016, the two Democratic primary candidates. So this is a sort of characterization by the nominee, Hillary Clinton, that talks about Bernie Sanders, who was the more left-wing candidate and who did, again, campaign on a free college platform, as well as other kinds of ambitious reforms. So the characterization is saying, well, basically what he's saying is, I think America should get a pony. As if these are kind of luxuries that the ignorant masses keep demanding, and serious people would ask the tough questions. And I'm not saying these are stupid questions. They're important questions, like how will you pay for the pony? Where will the pony come from? How will you get Congress to agree to the pony? Again, the pony being like free college education for everyone. So this paper tries to answer some of those questions from looking at some new theories, particular new legal theories, one called vulnerability theory and another modern monetary theory. And the answers I've put underneath there that I think these theories are coming up with of how you pay for the pony, the state's power of the purse. Where will the pony come from? Developing abundant capacity for social resilience. How will you get the government to agree to the pony? The power of democracy. And none of these answers are easy or simple, but nonetheless, I think they move us to saying, wait a minute, we can have more, we can ask for more from the state and expect more. So I'm going to go through it, just sort of talking a little bit about legal theory, liberal, what I call liberal legal theory, and then neoliberalism today, and how the two theories that I think are really exciting developments in law are challenging, especially the neoliberal version of this theory, by going back to some basic assumptions. So if you look at the next set of notes here, one of the basic assumptions that vulnerability theory in particular is challenging is who is the subject of government? Because who we think the state is about, who we think we are as members of a political jurisdiction, that really affects what we think the state should do, what we think law is supposed to be about. So the liberal legal subject is classically the autonomous, formally equal citizen and rational private economic producer. The neoliberal legal subject takes that up a notch and really transforms it in doing so. Not only is it the autonomous rational actor who is economically productive, but that, when you think about it, the ideal there becomes an inhuman person, an artificial, the corporation that can be supremely rational and supremely economically profit maximizing. The vulnerable legal subject, in the theory that I'm going to talk about here, shifts the tables and saying, wait a minute, who are we? We are all embodied, embedded human beings. We all have abundant capacity for social resilience. And I'll explain this a little bit more as I go along. But that's the idea of looking at what are the assumptions and how do they change what we think is possible. So, from the liberal idea of citizens being autonomous, independent, rational actors, we get the idea of the state being a neutral facilitator. And that leaves some room in facilitating rational, independent individuals to provide some social supports and to provide, education so people can develop their rational capacity. But it always creates a tension where the support for social capacities and social needs just can't go too far without the state somehow intervening in and being a kind of replacement for autonomy and turning people into dependents who are relying too heavily on the state. So that's the tension set up there. Now, neoliberalism goes even further, as I mentioned before. So humans in the neoliberal mindset and ideology are subtly kind of degraded. Humans really are full of prejudices, imperfect information, can never understand the full factual picture, always have subjective, contested preferences and interests. Politics, so humans, as saying, are really failed rational actors, failed calculators. Politics, in the neoliberal version, is not a space for public citizens to self-govern. Instead, it's a space that amplifies individual human failures. It just creates this illegitimate power that exacerbates the prejudices and the biases. So what do we really need, neoliberals imagine? We need a market that has the perfect invisible hand to provide perfect information that basically will discipline the unquenchable demands for ponies and other things that these irrational, biased individuals have. So what should this, so the states are omniscient optimizers of essential private scarcity. This assumes a world of harsh competition for scarcity. Market prices magically moderate that to give us the maximum possible of those scarce resources, which then can be used to benefit whatever we want. So looking at the next set of notes, the neoliberal efficient state, this is the idea of the state that comes out of this assumption about human nature and the role of the market. So money here is the fundamental scarce and private resource that the market generates, that the state depends on, that produces everything that anyone could value. So whenever you say, so for example, the government should prioritize education and not cut the budget, but put more money into teachers and students. And the answer is always like, well, if we put the money instead into maximizing financial returns, the most profits, we'll have the biggest economic pie overall. And then, once we have that bigger economic pie, we'll be able to afford more education and more well-supported teachers and students. So we need to wait and first maximize the pie, make sure that we're getting as much capital gain as possible from the private sector. So the legitimate state in this view ends up being a state that's main job is to quench the democratic demands from the masses for ponies and saying, wait a minute, we have to make the tough choices, we have to put maximizing the economic gain first. When we have that scarce money, then we can go and do the things that you want. This has led to a number of legal movements, both nationally in many places and internationally, the neoliberal efficient state that basically, in a kind of stealth way, not so explicit, centralizes anti-democratic legal authority. So from this view emerges an ideal of government, of the state, as imposing constitutional protection for unequal private financial power in human persons, essentially limiting, using the power of government to limit democracy and popular demands for more social benefits and social goods. How has this worked out? Well, in the United States, over the last several decades, there's been a subtle shift in constitutional law to constitutionalize economic inequality in a way, where the earlier vision was that economic policy was up to the democratic legislative process. You could fight for more education if you wanted. You just had to mobilize politically. Instead, there's been these constitutional restrictions. And one example is in First Amendment doctrine. First Amendment is the doctrine that protects free speech in the United States. So how does that do this? Well, it's the idea that number one, inhuman corporate persons have First Amendment free speech rights. And those rights have been expanded gradually, the rights to commercial speech. In other words, to say what you want even if it's fraudulent advertising to some degree. In the most infamous thing, of course, is what's the Citizens United decision, which basically said that the free speech right includes the right of corporate persons to spend on elections, basically to buy politicians, right? And to strike down democratic legislation that restricts campaign finance influence by wealthy organized entities. So that's considered free speech. right? Another recent decision this spring was about basically protecting as a fundamental free speech right the right of individuals to exit public employee unions while still getting the protection that those unions offer. And this was particularly an anti-teacher initiative, I think. Teachers being one of the more organized groups of public employees. And so, again, this was about making this fundamental right to undermine social systems of protection for personal advantage in inequality. A famous book, well, a book that's gotten a lot of publicity, came out last year, is called Democracy in Chains by Nancy McClain. And she has traced the history over the last 50 years or so of the economic ideas and plans that were funded by some extremely wealthy and infamous funders. The Koch industry is very active internationally now, basically to find a way to institute a lockbox, basically, on democratic policy that would restrict the rights of wealthy capital owners and businesses to maintain inequality. And these ideas in this is James Buchanan was, that she focuses on, a leading public choice intellectual who came up with a lot of the constitutional ideas of how to put economic power beyond democratic control, and that he was influential and was proud of the work that he did in the Pinochet regime in Chile back in the 70s to basically install a fascist regime to cut Social Security and other kinds of social systems. And then finally, a book came out this year called The Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism by Quinn Slobodian. Traces the history of a different group, sometimes overlapping, that he calls the Geneva neoliberals, and how they planned, basically fairly early in the 20th century, how we could establish a global legal architecture that would continue the hierarchies of empire for the new human rights post-colonial, post-war regime, without it being obvious that they were doing that. How did they do this? Well, it's conceptually, one of their key moves was to create the idea that economics is separate from politics, to create a dual sovereignty system where economic rights, especially of the wealthiest and corporations and basically global capital, would be protected through centralized legal authority globally. And that would leave sovereign democratic, or not democratic, sovereign governments to have a semblance of independence and control, but not really have power over their economic policy. And they came up with a lot of ideas that have been, to some extent, implemented through the international, investor dispute resolution systems in some of the international trade treaties, free trade, the free movement of capital was one important part of this. So a lot of detail about the policies that have actually established this, and to maintain the independence, so-called, of the central banks and currency control from basically the sovereign governments. And that this would, again, continue the same sort of anti-democratic power that had been the older empire, without people really understanding what would happen. The goal was to naturalize this, to make people think that's just how economics is. It's somehow the global economy has changed, so we have to do this. All right, so then I have another slide here, or a set of notes, that gives an example of the crazy thinking that has become natural through this shift. The ideas about economics, and this is the, what I'd say, inverted rationality of cost-benefit analysis. So this is one way that this cost-benefit analysis idea is has taken hold by even many leading progressive, sort of liberal, left-leaning law scholars in the United States. And it's one way, cost-benefit analysis is one subtle way in which the power of democratic legislation to control the economy has been cut off without people really realizing what's going on. So Cass Sunstein is the author of an article on cost-benefit analysis of climate change. He styles himself as a progressive. He was a top official overseeing regulatory policy in the Obama administration in the United States. So this paper that I'm focusing on here, he says, well, we should use cost-benefit analysis, right, to review policies about climate change, right? So any investment that people think we should make in avoiding climate change for future generations, we should approach rationally with hard-hearted economic thinking, not just sentiment, oh, we want to save the planet. So how do we do that? Well, when we're looking at how much should we spend on energy efficiency today in order to provide some protection against the costs of climate change in the future, in order to do that rationally, we have to discount the future savings because, right, the time value of money, it's different. $1,000 100 years from now, we should discount by the rate of investment we would get if we put that investment, what's the rate of investment returns we would get if we took that $1,000 and put it not into energy efficiency, but into the bank, right? If we could get a 5% a year return on that investment, in 100 years, we would have X amount more dollars. So we have to figure in that opportunity cost of the lost investment gains into any calculation of is it worth it, is it worth it to put the money into saving the planet? And so then I come up with this other quote here about on a Twitter feed this week about, okay, so that says we should save money, not the planet. And it's imagining the conversation between the last two people on Earth. Well, there were plans to save humanity, but they didn't cost out. And this is Stephanie Kelton, who's one of the leading economists in this new theory, well, newly revived theory of modern monetary theory. And she's saying, well, I should have learned of MMT. And the same plays out. I have some notes here on, why don't we put more money into in education? Because first we need to make sure that governments attract scarce private capital so that they'll have the money to then develop their economy, and then they'll be able to fund education better in the long run. So education always, we wait to the future. So we don't save the children, we don't save the people of the country, we save private capital, and somehow it creates this sort of cycle of debt. So countries like Argentina are perpetually increasing their debt and going back to cutting the teachers' salaries as the way to pay off the international creditors. So just quickly, two answers to this from the Vulnerability and the Human Condition Project, which is by a feminist legal scholar. It's been going on for 10 years. Martha Feynman at Emory University has led this. She's also got a center in Leeds here in the UK. How does this reorder that? Well, she rejects the idea that law in the state is about rational, autonomous individuals. She was a family law expert, still is. If you study family law, you kind of realize that, wait a minute, we were all born as helpless infants. We didn't engage in rational exchanges to get what we wanted. There's a whole universe out there of human existence that is in a state that the rational interest-maximizing exchange doesn't capture. So what does this mean? Well, it means that you think about it, what's ultimately the fundamentally scarce resource? It's not private capital or money. It's in the particularity of our individual embodied lives. We will all die, as far as we know. We were all born. That she challenges the neoliberal sort of anti-human formalism, as I call it, by saying, well, wait a minute, yeah, so human vulnerability means that we're not all rational actors, and in fact, we are imperfect as individuals. We are not in control of our lives. We do not know everything. But that's not the reason to try to get rid of humans and substitute some other ideal. Instead, it's about how can we think of this as a positive, generative, productive basis for law and society. And that's by saying there is enormous capacity from this inherent universal state of human vulnerability to join together and to collectively, socially, politically create enormous capacity for responding to our vulnerability and meeting the needs for quality of human life for the diverse range of particular beings in particular situations and the environment in which we are embedded. And so law's primary role from this perspective is creating, responding to that human vulnerability in an equitable way to develop the capacities that we all have and that can only be achieved through interconnected, interdependent relationships, not individual maximizing. Okay, then briefly, the other theory that I'm bringing into play here that I said has something important to say to shift the tables from this sense of that neoliberalism's normalization of privation and austerity and incapacity of government, the evisceration of the public. Modern monetary theory provides some of the economic thinking that shows us how we can have what Martha Feynman calls the responsive state, that first and foremost develops the social capacities and capitalizes and creates abundance from human weakness and vulnerability. Modern monetary realism says, what is money really? It's not a scarce private commodity of good. Money is a legal promise to pay. Money is a limitless writing instrument for mobilizing social production and provisioning the public purpose. It's the boundless public center. Money is always public. You can't have money, like it's not the pound note, the coin, has no value in and of itself. It's only valuable because there is a powerful centralized government with an established, trustworthy legal system to a certain extent that makes that a promise that other people will honor, that the government will honor when you use it to pay your taxes. So its value comes from the collective interdependence of a political and legal system. It's a public good. So what should we do with it then? Money, we should recognize, is limited only by our public imagination and political vision of what matters. And what should matter, as vulnerability theory tells us, it's this particular state of every human being's embodied, embedded existence. So what can we do with this? Well, we should reclaim money's power, public power, political power to meet the many social needs and visions and ambitious plans that will really address our state of human vulnerability. How can we do this? Well, we can use the power of the purse. Governments that control their own currencies could simply print money, so to speak, it's really computer keystrokes, to meet needs like education. Well, what about inflation? Inflation, modern monetary theory explains in some depth, is not simply a problem of too much money spent on social needs. And instead, it's a problem of when there's more money than there is actual useful things happening with that money. So in other words, what matters is not how much money the government spends or how much it incurs deficits. What matters is where that money is going. Is it going to develop really valuable, not just money, but what's really valuable to people and human beings in society? Is education really valuable? Is care work for children, for elderly people, is that valuable? And so MMT, like vulnerability theory, says yes, if you think of our state, of our being as vulnerable, embodied, embedded individuals, what matters the most is currently being way underdeveloped and not invested in enough. The environment, we invest in the environment, we invest in human development, that will produce real valuable results that will matter and will even be deflationary because they are at such undercapacity now. So that's how MMT comes up with things like saying, yeah, so we could fund a right to work for everyone, a guaranteed job. That's because so many people are not working at and not contributing to society what they could possibly do. Not contributing in terms of the dollar value in game, but again, measuring contributions in terms of care for the environment, care for each other, expression of artistic qualities and connectedness that we could, that would produce the qualities that are really in scarce supply and undervalued in today's economy. So I think by bringing together this vision of modern monetary theory with Feynman's vision of vulnerability theory and understanding what the fundamental assumptions are in law that are holding us back, we can really start to say that it's a very serious and rational and moral demand to say that governments can and should take charge of the supply of money, of social programming in a much more ambitious way. And that will require reforming the global legal architecture to give governments back that power over the money supply and to democratize the system. But that's the debate we should be having, not sort of imagining that this is natural economics that has created the system we have today.
So I am Yuille, and I'm happy to be here. I arrived this morning after a pretty long flight, and it's my daughter's birthday. She turned 7. I shouldn't have told you that because now I revealed I have a 7-year-old and that I'm old enough to have one. And I like to pretend that you couldn't tell that from all of this that I have going on. What I want to spend my time with you today doing is taking somewhat of a different take on this question or this idea of how do you pay for the pony. And I want to give some more thoughts about not just the you can pay for the pony, but the justification for paying for the pony in different ways, and pushing forward the idea that the government is already paying for ponies. It's just not the ponies that I may have asked for. But I want to do that. That's sort of substantively what I want to engage a little bit. But what I also want to do, and in some ways almost more important, what I want to do is challenge some epistemic and ontological hegemonies that exist. And I think it is accurate to say, as I'm viewing the epistemic and ontological hegemonies that I am challenging, I'm going to challenge in my presentation for you today, knowledge, right? How to know is defined in academic spaces by how white men have known and how they express their knowledge and how they find truth And I'm not going to do it that way because I'm not a white man. And while I can know in those ways, the very process of me translating how I know as a black woman into the terms that meet the standards set by the hegemonic powers changes the knowledge in ways that are both very powerful but often imperceptible, where we're living in the dominance of those hegemonies. So I'm gonna share my ideas with you the way I know. And in so doing, I'm also challenging ontologically a hegemony about what it means to be a scholar, right? Because what you have learned it means to be a scholar is to do knowledge and to find knowledge and to prove what you know through the standards of the white male scholar. That's not going to happen for you today. And I've been doing this my whole career, but I haven't always been telling people. And I tell you this because there are two things that are going to drive everything that I do today, which do not drive white male legal scholarship. And then what happens is that my audiences don't actually listen to the part that they're supposed to listen to because they think that I'm just wasting time because that's not the knowing part and that's not the scholarly part. It really messes up my students as well because they're like, class is over, you didn't do teaching. And I'm like, the teaching happened. You just missed out. So I'm giving you the clue that when you think I'm not doing the thing, I'm doing the thing. That's the thing. And that's because this project is really both a methodological project as well as a substantive project. And the two pieces of my methodology that I think are really important are dialogue and narrative. And both of these, my thing here is flipping all around. And I want to make sure I say all the things I want to say to you. But I want to give you a second and make sure you understand what I mean by dialogue. Because it's weird, because we're not actually having a literal conversation right now. But dialogue is contrasted with banking. And right now what I'm doing for you is banking. And I came across this idea of dialogue as I studied the work of Paulo Freire in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And basically banking, you can probably intuit what it is. It's what I'm doing right now. I have assumed that you don't know who Paulo Freire is. And Paulo Freire, and now I'm assuming that you don't know who Paulo Freire is, which may or may not be correct, but I'm doing that because I am the sage on the stage right now. And I'm assuming you don't know, and now I'm going to fill you with the relevant knowledge about Paulo Freire and his method of pedagogy and teaching and engaging in the knowledge building process, and that's dialogue. And what dialogue is about is developing generative themes and then an interchange of minds through which knowledge is created and the world is changed. So in pursuing everything that I do through this method of dialogue, what I'm going to do for you today is just put out there what I think are some generative themes. Generative themes are things that we can look about in the world and understand as issues, topics, spaces for our contemplation, right? Typically, generative themes deal with things that we might want to fix because that's what's going to draw our attention, and that's what's going to happen today. But generative themes could be any area of importance. And then I said the other thing, right, methodologically was narrative, and that was I'm going to tell you stories. And I said that I'm challenging this epistemological hegemony in which I'm supposed to give you cold, hard analysis. I can go look at these facts that might be coming out of my narratives that I'm going to share, and then I analyze them for you and fill you up. That's not what I'm going to do. I'm just going to share some of these narratives and maybe reflect a little bit, but hopefully get a chance to have a conversation. And I'm going to start right now with my first narrative. And I'm going to read this one because I really like it and I wrote it. But I'll tell you some others off the top of my head. Some lessons are so important, they get repeated to you. It's the 1980s. Okay now, you kids hush, whispered a worried voice that I wasn't used to hearing sound anything but cheery. I sit silently in the back of an Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme. willing my tiny frame to disappear. My brother hangs his head. My sister stares out the window. We don't move or speak or breathe as the police officer interrogates the white woman driver. Are you okay, ma'am? Are you sure you're okay? Do you know these children? Have they done anything to you? Are you safe? Are you sure? The woman is our grandmother, her blackness obscured by white skin and hazel eyes. Now it's the 90s. The glare of the squad car's headlamps illuminate a pristine black convertible Cadillac. My father's stern eyes reflect in the rear view mirror, wordlessly telling us, don't say a word. We don't move or speak or even breathe. My father sighs almost inaudibly while the officer interrogates a confused blonde girl. Are you okay, honey? Are you sure you're okay? Do you know these people? Have they done anything? Have they done anything to you? Are you safe? Are you sure? Now it's 2000 something or other. I'm driving my mother and sister home from work in our family Jaguar when we are stopped. My mother summons her weakened voice. Please, just stay calm. I want to arrive alive, so I sit silently, motionless. We all pull out our IDs. My mom breathlessly reiterates, please, just loud enough to be heard over the calm hum of her breathing machine. My sister begins to ask the police officer to explain one more time just how it is that our trio, that includes an old lady wearing an oxygen mask, a lawyer in workout clothes, and a teacher dressed like a school marm, fits the description of some people who just robbed a bank 100 miles away. My mother almost imperceptibly shudders, stealthily pinching my sister's thigh. My mother causes my sister to fall silent, and we stay that way as I carefully but deliberately navigate our way home. Now it's 2017, and I'm dressed pretty much like this, and it's early in the morning on a Wednesday, and we're in California. I live in Kansas. My daughter, who just turned 7, I told you that, she says, Mom. I said, yes. Why are you dressed like a lawyer? And I could have said, I normally would have said, I'm dressed like a lawyer because I am a lawyer, and I'm going to go do lawyer lady things. But this morning, I'm not dressed like a lawyer because I am a lawyer. This morning, I'm dressed like a lawyer because I'm about to get into the family car and head to a funeral parlor. And I walked out of my room dressed fancy because I wanted to be treated a certain way when I get to that funeral parlor. I'm visiting my family home, and no one has coordinated, but my sister comes out, and she's dressed in a suit. And my father comes out, and he's dressed in a suit. And we meet my brother, and he's dressed in a suit. And we silently nod as we realize, you too. Because on this day, when we were getting in our family car, my mom wasn't there anymore. And on this day, when we wanted to be wearing pajamas, when we wanted to be shrouded in the cloak of devastation, of sadness, we had to dress up so that on this day, my father would be treated with the respect he deserved when he had to bury his wife, who died too young. And that my mother, whose ultimate funeral would have 600 people, would be treated with the respect she deserved in that most clearly, of all clearly invulnerable moments. Now, there are a lot of little details that I shared in my narrative. I told you about Cadillacs, and my dad comes from a generation in the United States where Cadillacs are something. And I told you about Jaguars, beautiful Jaguars. And I mentioned professions like lawyers. And I told you about a fancy funeral that had 600 guests and cost $25,000. But all of that, all of those things that myself and I didn't tell you that because I'm a flosser and I like to talk about what I've got. It's not even that impressive. That's not the point. All of those things, all of these ways, we have been particularly designed in the context in which I live to shroud ourselves and to protect ourselves via the property that we own. Doesn't seem to function the same for everybody. Doesn't seem to function the same in all situations. I want to tell you one more story and then I'll tell you why I think these things go together. But what I really want you to do is ask yourselves whether and to what extent my stories say something. So I was coming here. My dad is staying with my kids back in Kansas. He lives in California. He's driving me to the airport. And we're having a conversation about the fact that from Manchester, I'm going to get on a train and go to Leeds. And we had recently taken a trip from Los Angeles, the Los Angeles area where my father lives, to San Diego on the train. And he was like, the train is awful. You just ride the train for experience because it's no good. And then he said, but I heard that like over there in Europe, the train's pretty nice. Tell me about when you used to live in Italy and Spain, how was the train good? And I said, yeah, the train is wonderful. And sometimes it sucks, let's just be honest. But as a system, it's wonderful. You can get there, because my dad is like, you get jostled. It's not actually fun. You just do it for the experience, right? He's talking the slow train here in the UK. When I was booking my train, it was a big sign that said, slow train, makes a lot of stops, don't take this one, take the good one that's comfortable, right? Well, that's all we have. Our only train in most of the United States is the slow awful. We don't have the wonderful transportation. So we started having this long conversation about trains. And I said, and I hadn't sat and thought and put all of these pieces of data that I knew together. I said, we have crap trains on purpose. Because in the United States, the government has taken our core form of addressing this universal human vulnerability. And we've selected one thing as the central way we protect ourselves, the central way we respond to that, and that's property, that's ownership. And the proxy for that ownership is something that we call money. But in the United States, we've selected money and property as the central way we protect ourselves, and then the US government and then state governments created a systematic project to ensure that that special protective mechanism would only be available in significant quantities to certain populations. And so there are a lot of processes. I'm just going to bring up two to make the point. That has to do with a process called redlining. And what redlining continues to be, but we like to say was because people like to pretend that this stuff doesn't still happen today. What redlining is basically a private law response that comes from banks. And basically banks set their risk management standards. If anybody knows about banking, right? You just don't give away money, right? And the government will let you just give away money, or you can be insured on the investments that you make, right? So you have to set lending standards. Well, but the process of redlining essentially set lending standards to ensure that black people and people who were categorized as black, whether or not we would call them black today or then, couldn't actually get home loans. And they were actually, it would already have been unconstitutional to do this for much of this period. So they couldn't just say no loans to black people. So they just said no loans in these areas. We're not going to lend you money to buy a house in these areas. And what it allowed, oh, and then that's one. The second thing was that the Federal Housing Authority was established in the United States. And they actually were underwriting home loans so that people could buy houses. And this was like an innovative thing. And people were buying houses. And the FHA loans were specifically not allowed to be given to black people, right? So we have these systems that come into place. And what these things do is allow and highly promote white people moving out of the city. And they move out of the city, and then what do we give them? Right? What do they think of the United States in your head. And what do you see? A huge sprawling country with highways and big cars, right? I said Cadillac. I didn't say smart car. I said Cadillac. I mean a Hummer, not Kia. Right? We gave you big highways, sent you into big towns. What would have happened if we built trains? All of those people who we wanted to get away from would have been able to hop on the train and come to your suburb. So when people say, oh, we don't know why there's no trains in America, yes you do. There's no trains particularly to separate who gets the ponies from who doesn't get the ponies. And then I looked and I said, I used to live in Italy. I lived in Italy for a few years. And I said, oh, it's very different. You can think about this if you think of France as well, right? We even use terms differently. If you speak to a speaker of English in the United States, urban means black. I teach at an urban school. It means you teach where black people are, right? Go to other places, urban just means my school is in the city. Go to other places, urban might mean I teach immigrants, right? In the United States, it means I teach black people. When I lived in Italy, I was like, oh, trains are excellent. They're not like France or Spain trains, but they're good, right? And the people with the ponies live in the city, and working class people live outside of the city. And you go to Paris, and the worst neighborhoods, right, al margine, on the margins of the city. This isn't on accident. People don't move themselves in these ways, right? We have property structures, specific rules that don't just incentivize us, that force us into one space or the next space. And then, right, the monetary value associated with what we own is circumscribed by where we're able to have our property, right? When my family, I was graduating from high school, my family decided to sell their house. My mom got this idea that we didn't need a big house anymore because I'm the youngest. All the kids are gone, right? And they have the empty nester syndrome. My mom is like, downsize. So they put our house on the market. We lived in a fancy neighborhood. I told you we had a fancy car, right? They put our house in the market, and it wouldn't sell. And it wouldn't sell. And it wouldn't sell. And that sucked for me because that meant our house had to be clean all the time. So every day before school, I had to like clean up and put all my stuff away. And I was just like, sell the house. Give it away. Come on. I'm tired of doing this. Finally, the realtor comes and is very awkward and uncomfortable. And, you know, has to tell my family, what we think would be really helpful to sell your house. We're from California, so this is how we sound. What we think would be really helpful to sell your house is if you took down, like, you know, your family photos and those paintings of all those black people that you have in your house. And I was mad because my dad made me, like, help him do this. But my dad was sort of hunkered down and quietly said, okay. And he takes it down And very shortly thereafter, we sold our house, and our house sold for the least money in the neighborhood. A bunch of people were moving when we were moving. Our house sold for the least amount of money, right? So just by us being there, this thing that the government told us was the way we protect ourselves, right? The way we respond to our vulnerability was less valuable. It was less able to protect me than it was for other people. Okay. I'm going to make one connection to law for you, but I really want you to think about how this connects to law. So both modern monetary theory, well, I should say, modern monetary theory tells us that we can make the money, and that we can have the money. But one of the huge critiques, and I work in this area, and so I feel comfortable making the critique, one of the huge critiques is that it doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about who we make the money for. And I keep saying, we've been making the money. We've been making the money. Governments every day just print money, which, as Martha said, is not actually what is happening, right? It's boop, 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 boops. I used to be a computer engineer, so I shouldn't be flippant about like tech stuff, but I do. It is bits. It is bits on a computer, but we bake them all the time. My first job as a corporate lawyer at a big law firm in New York City, they used to tell us these amazing stories about lawyers who we would do deals, billions of dollars of deals, and we literally printed the money on paper. It was called security paper. And like, I've done it, it's like amazing. I would print out a little on a piece of security paper and I just would like type on my computer. I owe you $2 billion. That would be essentially like give the bearer of this piece of paper $2 billion. Now, by the time I did this, sorry, go back. In like the 80s, lawyers would do the same thing, except for it wouldn't be on a computer. It would be like typed up. Some secretary would type it up. And then the lawyer would put it in a briefcase and handcuff the briefcase and like run on Wall Street to deliver the bonds. I didn't get to do that part. It would be so exciting. Though, I don't know if I would have arrived alive if I was running in Wall Street with a briefcase handcuff. I don't really fit the description of a handcuff runner who survives running with handcuffs. But like the image was amazing. But we were making this. And when I worked at my law firm in New York, we literally created new forms of commercial paper. We created money every day. There's a conversation today about Bitcoin, right? So we're creating money. Like the intellectual forebearers of modern monetary theory say, it's easy to create money, it's getting accepted. That's hard, right? And it's easy to create a store of value. It's getting accepted. That's hard. And it becomes hard in ways that are really systematically evident. And a part of that, and this gets us to vulnerability theory, a part of that is the refusal, the systematic refusal of government, of lawmakers, to accept a crucial insight of vulnerability theory, which is that the entire idea that we are the liberal autonomous subject, that we even want to be autonomous, is a myth. Those people who moved to the suburbs where black people like me couldn't go, they didn't want to be autonomous. They wanted the government to build a road, right? And they wanted wonderful, free schooling for all in their suburbs. They didn't want to build it themselves, right? Barack Obama got pilloried for saying, you didn't build that business. But he was not wrong. You didn't build that business. And you can like or dislike Barack Obama for that to be true, right? We systematically supported people. We insure your investments if you fall into these categories. And what vulnerability theory helps us see? That none of us, not only are we not autonomous, we don't want autonomy. What we want the government to do is be responsive not just to the interests, needs, and desires of those big banks and those big companies that I represented. And not just people who fall in favored groups, but to all of us at all stages of our lives. That's a big ask, but it's not actually a hard ask. That's what I got for you.
Both of you sort of implied how the inequality in laws got us into some of the structural aspects. Do you have any hope for law helping us get out of the hole, changing the system? Or is it all down to changing political will first?
So, I think, you know, the common refrain is that a lot of this stuff is outside the capability of law, and that law is not the appropriate mover of these things. I think that that is an accurate reflection of history, but also reflects, and I didn't talk about this, sort of the pedagogical impact of law. What the law does today tells us what the law has the capacity to do. And I think a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, in order for it to come about in a sustained way that is not going to be systematically chipped away at or made to do nefarious things, we have to re-envision from the bottom up what it means to be and do law. In common law jurisdictions like we come from, that you were in, you're right, like there's this idea of settled precedent. And I think that that's one thing that maybe we have a conversation about, because, you know, inequality and the systems and mechanisms of inequality are technological and they advance faster than the iPhone. And so yesterday's discrimination or yesterday's whatever is out of date by the time we figure out how to deal with it. And so the idea of settled law, and I'm not saying I know how to re-envision this in a way that also still gives it bite and power, but that's one place where I see us wanting to have a new conversation.
And just to say that law has been a central technique of the neoliberal construction of the economy seemingly as a bunch of forces that kind of globally come to bear without law. So it's about hiding and confusing people about the role of law. The actual competition between nations in this race to the bottom for private capital that is hamstringing a lot of countries from developing education, it's real, but it's really imposed by law. It's about setting up the currency structures and the international financial systems so that money is scarce and unequal, and that gets international legal protection, and the rights to teachers and students do not get an international tribunal that puts their rights above everything else and that requires equality among humans, only equality among investors. So don't play into the idea that law can't change things. It does. What we need is basically claiming that we can have different laws and better laws, and in fact we should push for those and ask, why don't we? So.
Do you think that issues such as gentrification will still arise despite property regions and things like that becoming more egalitarian due to like fashions and materialistic trends?
Gentrification is equally a process. It's a legally structured process. How does gentrification work? You create mechanisms so that the people who currently live, the favored populations in an area, can leave that area. And so, like, we use, take Harlem in New York City. What do we have? We create systems so people can leave Harlem and go upstate or move to New Jersey because they can buy houses there and get more space. And we tell them that having houses and more space is better. We force The remaining, in the case of Harlem in New York, which I'm describing, right, we force black people and Latinos and Latinx people to be in those neighborhoods, and then the property value, right, but we associate values with those two places. Property values plummet so that there are a class of white people who are now wanting to be, closer to things that are happening in the city and they're not able to buy in the suburbs because the whiteness of the suburbs makes that so expensive. So they come and return to neighborhoods that they had abandoned and forced other people in. If you that's all legally structured. If you could get rid of gentrification by getting rid of discrimination and having white people actually be willing, by the way, I say white people be willing to live by brown people because the statistics show that it's white people who segregate themselves and brown people who wind up in neighborhoods that are homogenous, right? Like, so 95% of white people in the United States only live by white people. That results in like 75 to 80% of brown people, but it's a white thing that's happening. If you get rid of that, yeah, we won't necessarily have gentrification, but we will still have the mechanisms that make it possible. If we change the structures, then I think we will have, we might have a neighborhood change, because neighborhoods change and cultures develop. We tend to denominate it gentrification when there's this nefarious underlying problem, and so we might have neighborhood change, but we won't look at it. At least those of us who look at it critically might not see it critically.
And also I think vulnerability theory challenges us to see needs like housing not as a question of special populations who somehow can't make it in the market, but by saying, look, a universal human need for shelter, right? So housing is one of those things that is a public problem and a public good that we can develop people's capacity by publicly supporting education. And she says, how are we going to finance that? Housing is something that takes lending, investment. It's not a one-time autonomous exchange. So do we create it by having unequal private property in capital and financing individual mortgages, or do we create it by setting up public housing funding that makes that universal and affordable and integrated? Do we create land trusts, for example, community land trusts that combat the inflationary trends that the current system of private real estate as a private capital asset and very unequal are designed to maintain? So there's a lot we can do legally, but it requires changing the whole system, and I think looking for those universal, making it a universal equal value that deserves, how are we controlling money and financing in a different way?
How do you make vulnerability theory work internationally? I agree with that. I think it's a really good lens to look at things through. But you seem to be putting a lot of trust in international institutions, and I imagine that you would have a sort of democratic, or you'd have people harnessing democratic issues to say, well, we have to take this policy choice to help those people over there. You can immediately see how that discourse is kind of utilised by someone else. So how do you escape kind of the traps that we've already fallen into with international institutions? Even if they are doing good things, they still create a democratic deficit, democracy deficit.
I think one problem that we face is the marketization of democratic processes, right? The idea, so I write about the market for rights. And that's a fundamental problem that I write about that, because we shouldn't have turned rights into scarce resources. And so I think that is a part of it. I think a part of this goes into the idea that we've talked about there are some real resource limitations that exist. But a huge swath of resource limitations are manufactured by the cult of market, of the deity of the market. And so I think if you begin to deconstruct that cult, one of the things that we'll start to see, hopefully, is that the places that it's bled into, we'll be able to take them out of those conversations. But at the same time, I think sort of in its 10-year history, there's been a lot of discussion of vulnerability theory in different contexts and different national contexts, but it is like a growing conversation about how do we translate these insights into supranational and international governance. The best, for me, the best hope is to really understand equally that when we talk about the state and the obligations of the state in the context of vulnerability theory, it's not, it is the state that we have, but it's not the state that we have, right? The responsive state has a lot of the features of the present state or any supranational or international governing body, but it's different, right? It has a different legal subject as its focus, and that will fundamentally change it.
And I think that's a great question, and I've been struggling with some examples of what might be different. And one is to think of, there's a work by Nicole DeWandra, who works for the European Commission on digital policy in a philosophical way. And so she talks about, we don't want to think about the sovereign state, we want to think about a relational state. And I also think about, like, Martha Feynman's Vulnerability Project uses the word responsive state. So in other words, we're not thinking of the government as this neutral reflector of individual autonomous decisions and preferences. It's not like that simple idea of democracy as representing each of our own individual ideas and combining them. It's the idea that we create a collective institutional space that creates a whole that's entirely different than the sum of the individual parts. We do that not by having experts like regulatory officials, like in the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States. The idea is not to develop people who know it all and then can provide the expertise, whether it's through cost-benefit analysis or otherwise. One example of this in practice is in a talk I heard about by some women officials in African-American women officials in the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States back in Democratic administrations, who were trying to center environmental regulation on what is called environmental justice. In other words, thinking of the inequalities in how that plays out in the policy. And so one thing that they did is, rather than trying to sort of have this very expert process of like pure scientific analysis and cost data and all of this, is when there was a problem that they were trying to respond to and to decide what's the solution to, say, hazardous waste in a community that's causing pollution, they actually think what we need to do is get out there in the community and hold a town meeting that brings together representatives from different parts of the community and to just listen and to have them say what they need. And one of the things they came up with, and some examples of this, was they wanted to break down the barriers and the divisions within the government's response. So not just thinking of taking environmental action, but all of a sudden they realized that there was a whole bunch of stuff going on with sort of real estate development and employment in the area and farm policy. And so and then they came back with officials from all these different areas of government and continued a dialogue and got people to see things differently even when they didn't agree with what the government was going to do. Another example is, instead of simply, again, hearing from individual commentators or commenters about a regulatory policy, I think is the model of something I worked in back before I went into academia, was that in public utility regulation, part of the regulatory budget went not to expert lawyers and regulators working to make the decisions, but to create advocacy groups, grassroots advocacy groups for people, so that rather than hearing from just individuals or elected officials, regulatory bodies would respond to groups that developed collective expertise and advocacy resources and then came to weigh in like that. So I think the idea of vulnerability thinks of democracy not simply as individual power, but as building different collective publics who can then develop the collective perspectives that may be missing and invest in the resources to do that effectively.
I also think, and there's a broad literature and there's evaluations of how it was implemented in practice, but a really great place where we saw experimentation towards these kinds of things, even though they weren't under some specific rubric, is the open method of coordination in the European Union. And so this was a process where you had broad goals that were responsive to various different legislative priorities of the EU. And you had not just, you had, a range of stakeholders, so policymakers from the countries, policymakers at the supranational level, but also expert knowledge in the area. So if we're talking about, positive action, experts who are working in this area who come together and talk about what we have tried and try to create sort of knowledge and wisdom about how we can address some of these things. Again, in a history, in a fraught political EU, whether or not the outcomes and it was faithfully implemented forever is a different question, but sort of an idea of democracy looking different can be found in closer to home in the open method of coordination.
Well, thank you for spending time together. Thank you again to